All right, so Vikki, thank you so much for coming in. We're really excited to have you. And part of the 60-day novel writing challenge, one of the days is we're talking all about researching character occupations. So guys, I have brought you Vikki. She's like the research guru.
Oh, I love that title.
No, you really are. She actually has a whole book about it here. So Vikki, I'm gonna let you tell everybody what you do and like why research is so important and how you can help people find resources for this sort of thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, guys. I'm Vikki Carter. I'm also known as the author's librarian. And so if you don't know what a librarian is all about, I'm going to give you kind of a little clue. We're all here to help you to do your research. And so authors sometimes don't realize that librarians are there for that reason. So I'm kind of breaking into the writing community to let you all know. I did write a book about it too to help writers kind of get their feet in with researching because there's a lot of questions that we get. So I actually am a librarian by trade. My background is librarian. I have a master's in library information technology, so 2 degrees. And I've been a librarian in public libraries, I've been in school libraries, and I'm now in academic libraries. And then I'm also a writer. So working on my second book. They're not published, they're historical fiction, working on that part, but then I sidetracked and I wrote this book for writers about how to do research well. And so then that came out in March and here I am visiting with you and you great people. So happy to share what I know.
I'm really excited. So I know, Vikki and I have gotten together. We go to coffee sometimes. And it was funny. I was just asking her, how did we meet? And I couldn't even remember, but I think she actually found my books up at the local coffee shop. And then,
I stalked her, so you all know.
So she's very good at her research, you guys. That's how we ended up meeting, actually. So I know that you have some very strong opinions when people just go to Google to find their information. So Vikki, is that the standard? Is that good research if we just go Google some things and look for information that way?
So from a library standpoint, no. It'll make a librarian cringe when an author says that they just Googled or just Wikipedia. And let me share with you the reason why. And then I'll share with you a reason or a way that Google and Wikipedia are useful. But first I'm going to tell you a story from my librarian and writer standpoint. So I was super excited, decided I was going to write not this book, but a historical fiction book. And so I was grabbing books from all over anytime I stopped anywhere local. So I was down at the nursery garden in Woodland and one of the, there was a book sitting out there and it was a self-help book and it was self-published. And I'm like, oh man, I want to read this. I want to see what they're doing because that's part of the whole learning curve for me. And so I bought it and I started to read it and the first chapter in, the author referred to a quote that I knew very well, but it was misquoted. There was there was a little bit of, the words weren't right. I'm like, this is weird. So I flipped through to her reference page to find out where she got the quote because I was curious as a librarian, but also as just a person, right? And all of her research came from Wikipedia and I just gagged. I'm sorry, but I was like, oh, and I put the book down and I couldn't read it anymore because as a librarian, here's the deal. Google and Wikipedia are not reliable sources. That's just the fastest way to say it. As we know, especially in this last year, we've seen how social media, Google, Wikipedia, the internet can just put out really inaccurate or dangerous information. As a writer, you want to be completely authentic and you want to have authority in what you're doing. Even if you're writing fiction, you want to have authority in your story. And so by just referencing Google research or Wikipedia research, automatically what that will do is give you less credibility. And people don't think about that. So that's what my mission is all about. So I'm a Google Wikipedia basher. So
get ready, guys.
If you see me on my YouTube channel, if you hear me on my podcast, you read my book, I'm very clear about this. But that's because I feel like us librarians, we hold a lot of tricks and keys to researching, but we don't share that with people as much. And so that's what my mission is for writers, is to share that with you guys because there's some really great places you can start. So where Google and Wikipedia are fantastic is that they're great idea generators, and that's how I call it. So if you're doing your general beginning of your research and you just need to get your brain unclogged or you need an idea because you don't have one, right? Google, Wikipedia are fantastic for that, but don't stop there. And that's kind of as far as I'm going to go because of my book and everything else I do. I really go in depth depth about how to use them in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
But they're great for generating those ideas. But don't stop your research there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a story about this book that I was reading. It was about witches, and I was thoroughly enjoying it until, well, maybe I should preface the story by saying I'm a really bad runner. I know this seems really unrelated, but I'm terrible at it.
Me too.
And so, yeah. And so I, as a bucket list item, just because I like to do this to myself, decided I was going to run a marathon. And I trained for it for 2 years. I mean, I was out running like 50 miles a week. It was brutal. And the day that I ran my marathon, you guys, it was awful. I had run 21 miles was the max I'd ever done before, and a marathon is 26.2. And so I just figured, I can run 5 miles in my sleep at this point. That last 5 miles will be nothing. Well, it's not nothing. And in those last 5 miles, my body was breaking down, and I was like delirious, and I'm like getting to the finish line. I'm eyeballing, there's police officers all along the sides. I'm like, which one of these men is going to carry me across the line as I pass out? I was just absolutely breaking down. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because I'm now reading this book about witches, and I'm having the best time. Like, it's really cool. These guys are on the run, and then one of the main characters, who's been in hiding for months, they're like hiding in basements and stuff, is talking about how they've gotten really fit since they've been running from the witches. And so they need to go somewhere, and he just takes a nice 26-mile jog into the next town, and he shows up and he's like, whew, wow. And he thinks to himself, gosh, that was a whole marathon. Like in another life, that might have been hard. And I read that, and I closed the book. I did finish it. I'll be honest. I did finish the book, but I was so unenthused about the book after that little detail of, just ran a marathon. And the amount of years of very, very intense training I had to go through. And then the breaking down that I experienced, to see them describe a marathon so poorly was absolutely, it took me out of the story. I've never read anything by that author again. I probably never will.
Yeah.
And so what recommendations do you have to avoid things like that, because not everybody would realize those details. They might think that if you've been hiding in basements for 2 months doing push-ups that you could go run a marathon. Well, how do you figure those things out if you have not experienced them yourself?
Awesome. Well, first I want to acknowledge that. It's probably one of the best stories I've heard about credibility in researching. So thank you for sharing that. I'll probably steal it someday.
Please do. It was painful to read.
No, it's great, because that just shows you exactly how it's not going to happen to all your readers. Like, if you don't do your research well, not all your readers are going to pick up on maybe some shoddy research. But you have one person, and we want to reach everybody, right? We want to make them our fans. So just that one person kills me. I don't want that to happen to any author at all. So back to your question, how do you do that? The most important thing is to be very intentional in your research. And that's the best way I can say it. So I've had this conversation with a lot of authors. They're like, when do I start my research? Do I write my first draft first? Do I research? So researching is an organic experience. It's like the writing craft. So there's no one specific way to get started, when to start it, or how to start. But my recommendation is this. When you're starting your first draft, write your first draft, let that free flow come through. That's when you're going to develop questions that you need to research on, right? And then you can develop a research plan. And I talk all about research plan in my book, but also it's going to be part of my online course that I'm going to do, is show people how to do this. Because I can tell you all you want, but it's actually the physical act of doing it will help reinforce it. So I look at researching as part of the writing craft. So it's organically happening as you're writing. So for your example, where maybe that individual was thinking they were doing great, right? And that whole aspect of it, he may have never had it picked up, but if he had it picked up from a beta reader or from his editor, say, yeah, this doesn't line up, that's probably when he would have been able to go back and do some research on what it's like to be a runner. So we're not always going to pick up on everything. It's always best to have people read your manuscript, so when those questions come about. So this happens to me too in my own writing. I love researching, but I have gaps all the time too. And so when my writers group or my beta reader, my editor pick up these things, that's when I know, I need to go back and do some research on that. Now, I've already done a lot of research before I start writing, but there's always going to be questions that come up, and those questions are what you want to research on.
Okay.
So does that answer the question a little bit?
I think so, yeah. And, you know, on that note, I was wondering about specifically fantasy worlds, when things are totally made up and it's magic. How do you research something like that when everything is make-believe?
Magical. Yeah. Make-believe. That is such a great question, and I love when people ask me that question. So, correct me if I'm wrong, almost all fantasy is based on something, right? So it's based on either historical references, it's based on a potential future, it's either based on scientific information, or it's based on our fantastic world of witchcraft or things like that. All those things have already been placed into the world for us. Fantasy, even though it's coming from the author's mind, is still based on something. To be true to the readers, the best fantasy, honestly, is because it's picking up a point that somebody is going to resound with. So if it's magic, or if it's, which a lot of magic and things like that come from, I can't think of the name of it, like mythology, that's what it is. So mythology. So all of that has already been placed out there for you. So the best way to do that, in my opinion, is definitely write your first draft and get started on that first draft, because you're not going to know the questions that you need to go look for until you have your first draft written, or close to your first draft, or your outline, like you're doing your 60-day novel challenge, which I love, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It's really helping to put a formulaic aspect of the story you want to tell. And as you start doing that, when you start feeling gaps, or when you start feeling like, oh, this just doesn't have enough feet to it to be something that can hook. For example, let's say I was writing about fairies, and I didn't really know that there's like 5 or 6 different types of fairies that are in mythology. But there are. I know this or two, but I didn't know this as I was writing, right? And so as I'm writing this, I feel like my fairy needs an opposing other fairy in the world that would possibly have different magic. But I don't know where to go with that. And maybe I need to go and do something in search for an archetype of fairies, or go look for that. That's a research opportunity right there. So archetypes, you know, mythology, all of that, that you can use in your fantasy world. And then you can let it filter through your brain as you've done the research to create the world that you want to build, right? So fantasy, I feel like a lot of fantasy authors don't do enough research. And you can read, when you read a book, I lose interest in a book when the world is made up with too much of a person's mind. Like their language is so different, their world doesn't, I have nothing to relate to in their world because it's so fantastical, I guess you could say. You know, it's like in the author's mind, but it doesn't connect with me. The best fantasy that I've read, and this is just my opinion, are ones where I can relate to. So if the world feels like a world that I can relate to, or if the characters feel like characters that are human or almost human, or have human qualities, human emotions, or, you know, aspects, then I can relate to that. So those are ways that you can research for fantasy, tying it into things that readers can have a connection to in mythology, in in science. Science is a big one. And there is a lot of awesome science research out there. Like, you could get lost forever. And also the ancient mythologies is very good, and archetypes are very, very good. So as a writer, if you're writing, I don't care what genre it is, you should know about archetypes, and you should know about how those archetypes can play with your characters and how your character fits on an archetype. And that's also great research too.
And I find that with all of these things that I research, I just get so many ideas from them too. You know, like when you look at mythology, you probably aren't going to take exactly those gods or those powers. And, you know, maybe you look at fairies and you see the way that they work in different cultures. You don't have to use those exactly, but it might give you those ideas for, oh, wow, my fairies really are lacking something that they could have that I should probably add in. There's so much that you can take away from that research. And also, science is huge. Understanding how things work. I know that magic is its own thing, but having that scientific backing behind it of like, well, this is why these work together is actually very, very helpful when it comes to fantasy.
And magic is fantastic, and I love magic to death, but I am more drawn to magic that's plausible. And magic that's plausible, and I know there's cases in fantasy where plausible magic is relevant and is needed to move the story along. But I feel like readers and myself will feel more embracing to the world you're building if the magic is plausible.
Yeah.
And I feel that way with movies too. But this is a great question because I get this question not just for fantasy, I get it for crime fiction writers. I've had people ask me, how do I research crime? Like I'm writing a book on with a detective. I'm not a detective. I don't have a clue what a detective does. So it doesn't matter what genre you're writing it. There's so many awesome opportunities beyond Google and Wikipedia. So you gotta there, don't I?
I like it. He just slipped it right in.
to find these resources, and that's what my mission is, to help authors find those avenues so that they can be super credible and their readers just love them and love their stories.
Gosh, that is all the questions I had for you, Vikki. So do you have any parting words for the members of the 60-Day Novel Writing Challenge and everybody who is looking to research for their book? Any last words you'd like to leave us with?
I do. Keep going with it. This is like such a huge, awesome journey that you're doing with the 60-Day Novel. And I can say that because I'm an author too. And we didn't talk about how we actually met, so I'm going to plug that too. I have a podcast.
Yes, you do.
And so what I did was, when I started my journey about 3 years ago, when I decided I was going to be an author, I was like, I don't know anybody that's an author. I don't know anything about the craft. So I started asking people that I heard were authors. And I stalked people like beautiful Haley. And I said, what do you do? How did you get published? What is all this about? And then I realized this is a great podcast. So I hit record on Zoom, because we were doing Zoom at the time. And I created a podcast. And so I have learned so much about the writing journey, the craft, and all of that through my podcast. So it's all there for you. That I have over 150, close to 150
That
episodes.
Is a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot of
and
dedication.
It's all authors that have gone through the journey. Many are self-published, so you're going to learn a lot from there. But so the thing that I would say, because I've done this with a podcast now one book that's out that I have to promote, and I have other books going, just keep going on the journey. It's probably the best journey you're ever going to have. And be a part of great groups like this, the 60-Day Challenge, the group that you form around that. For me, it was the authors that I formed around my podcast and then extended out to my community and the writing community. That community saved my life when it came to the struggles that you come through when you're writing. And so I think you're doing a beautiful job of providing that for individuals, so you should feel lucky you're on this.
We do have a really good group that I'm very happy about. Well, let's go ahead and hold this up so that we can show them. This is Vikki's book. It's all about researching and how to do that in the best way possible. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Bye-bye.